There's a moment, usually somewhere past 70, when you catch your own reflection in a store window, and for half a second you don't recognize the person looking back. Not because you look older. You already expected that part. It's because you look calmer. Something in your eyes isn't fighting anymore. You used to lie awake replaying conversations, wondering what people thought of you, what you should have said differently, what they meant by that pause before they answered. Now you can't even remember the last time you did that. So here's the question worth sitting with today. What actually changes in a person, quietly, without warning, somewhere after 70? And why does almost nobody talk about it until it's already happened to them? Stay with me. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly what that calm in the mirror has been trying to tell you all along. Today we're going to walk through 8 things that most people only understand after 70. Not because their minds got slower, but because their hearts finally got honest. These aren't lessons you can rush or read your way into ahead of schedule. They arrive on their own timeline, usually after enough loss, enough love, and enough quiet mornings to actually sit still long enough to listen. Some of what we cover will feel like relief, like something finally being named out loud after years of going unspoken. 1 or 2 might sting a little, in the way truth sometimes does right before it sets you free. But by the time we reach the end, you may see your own life a little differently, even the parts you were certain you already understood completely. Let's start with the one almost nobody expects. Reason number 1 is time itself, or more precisely, how completely your relationship with it quietly rearranges itself when you're not paying attention. Think back to the last slow Sunday morning you had. Coffee going cold on the table. No plan, no errand, nothing to prove to anyone. Did you notice how different those 15 minutes felt compared to how they would have felt 20, even 10 years ago? For most of your life, time worked like currency. You spent it on goals. A career to build, children to raise, a mortgage to pay down, a future that always seemed to need just one more year of effort before it finally arrived. Every day got measured by what it produced. A good day was a productive day, and rest had to be earned, usually with a little guilt attached even after you'd earned it fair and square. That's simply how the middle of a life works. You're building something, and building requires forward motion, deadlines, and a stubborn refusal to sit still for too long, even when your body is quietly asking you to. Somewhere after 70, that arithmetic quietly stops working. Not because you gave up on ambition, but because the future stopped feeling infinite, and something in you finally took notice of that fact, even if you never said it out loud. When time feels endless, we tend to spend it carelessly. We save the good parts for later, assuming later is guaranteed, assuming there will always be another Sunday just like this one. But once you sense the edges of your own timeline, even faintly, everything close to you sharpens without you having to try. A grandchild's laugh stops being merely pleasant. It becomes evidence, proof that you are here now for this exact moment, and that the moment matters simply because it's happening, not because of what it leads to or where it's taking you next. This isn't about fear. It's closer to the opposite. It's what finally lets you live inside a moment instead of constantly reaching past it toward the next one on your list. Younger people plan a good life, checking off milestones like a schedule. People who've lived long enough learn to notice one instead, and noticing takes far more courage than planning ever did, because it asks you to stop, even when stopping feels unproductive, even when some old voice in your head insists you should be doing something else with your hands right now. There's a particular kind of peace that comes from this, one that's almost impossible to explain to someone who hasn't reached it yet. It isn't the peace of having everything figured out. It's the peace of finally putting down the constant calculation of what comes next. You stop asking, what is this leading to, and start simply asking, what is this? A walk becomes a walk again instead of exercise you're tracking. A phone call becomes a conversation again, instead of an item you're crossing off a list. Nothing about the moment itself changed. What changed is that you're finally, fully inside it. That's not slowing down. That's finally arriving. But noticing your own moments is one thing. Noticing, or rather, no longer needing what other people think of you. That's an entirely different battle, and it's the second thing that quietly changes, usually right around the same stretch of years. You stop measuring your days by what you accomplished, and you start measuring them by what you actually felt while you were living through them. That shift alone can turn an ordinary Tuesday into something worth having been alive for, even if nothing about the day would make it into a photo album. Which brings us to something that took most of your life to unlearn. The exhausting habit of performing for an audience that was never really watching as closely as you always assumed they were. Have you ever caught yourself, even now, starting to explain a decision to someone who didn't ask? Justifying why you didn't call back sooner, why you spent the money on yourself for once, why you finally said no without an elaborate excuse attached. For decades, you carried an invisible committee everywhere. Parents, bosses, neighbors, even strangers passing by at the grocery store, silently grading your choices as though your life were an ongoing performance review. You dressed for their opinions. You picked careers partly for their approval. You measured your own worth in the currency of what other people would think if they ever found out. This wasn't vanity, and it certainly wasn't weakness. It was survival wiring built early back when belonging to the group genuinely determined your safety. A child who displeased the tribe risked real consequences, real exile, real danger. That instinct doesn't simply switch off because you grew up. It follows you into your 40s, your 50s, sometimes deep into your 60s, quietly steering decisions you were convinced were entirely your own the whole time. Somewhere after 70, something remarkable happens to that invisible committee. It starts thinning out, member by member, without you ever formally dismissing anyone. Not because you stopped caring about people you still love deeply, maybe more openly and more generously than ever before, but because you finally notice how few of those judging voices ever actually mattered, and how much of your one irreplaceable life you spent auditioning for people who weren't even paying attention in the first place. You start to understand a strange, freeing kind of math. Most people are too busy managing their own invisible committee to spend much time grading yours. The stranger at the store forgot your outfit 30 seconds after seeing it. The colleague who once seemed so relentlessly critical was drowning in their own insecurities the entire time, projecting their fear onto whoever stood closest. You just couldn't see any of that clearly from the inside of your 20s, or even your 40s. This is why so many people describe their 70s and 80s as strangely, unexpectedly free. Not despite losing things, but partly because of what they finally stopped carrying around. Think about what that actually frees up. All that energy you once spent rehearsing conversations before they happened, second-guessing a comment 3 days after you made it, choosing your words to avoid a reaction that, in hindsight, was never really coming. That energy has to go somewhere once you stop spending it on an audience that was never really watching. Most people discover it goes right back into the people who actually deserve it. The grandchildren who want your undivided attention, not your polished performance. The friend who needs you to say the honest thing instead of the polite thing. You didn't lose your consideration for others. You just stopped wasting it on people who were never going to remember the exchange anyway. That's not carelessness. That's finally being honest about whose opinion was ever real to begin with. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't the kind of video you skim through, and what's coming next builds directly on what we just uncovered, so stay close because it gets a little more personal from here. You've stopped performing. But there's still the matter of everything you've been quietly holding on to, the grudges, the old arguments, the version of a person who hurt you 15 years ago and still, somehow, lives rent-free in your head, showing up uninvited at 3 in the morning. Picture the argument you still replay sometimes, late at night, decades after it actually happened. You know exactly how it goes. You could recite both sides from memory. And some part of you is still, even now, trying to win it, refining your closing argument for a courtroom that closed a long time ago. For most of your life, holding on felt like strength. Letting go of a grudge seemed like letting someone off the hook, like admitting the wrong didn't matter, like losing something you weren't willing to give up. So you kept score. You kept the argument alive in your head long after the other person had forgotten it entirely, rehearsing your side, sharpening your case, as if there were still a verdict waiting to be handed down. This is exhausting work, though most people never clock it as work at all. It just feels like being right, like standing your ground. Somewhere after 70, the math on that finally flips. You start to notice that the person you're still arguing with in your head might not even remember the argument happened. That the energy spent protecting an old wound has cost you far more than the original wound ever did. Letting go stops looking like defeat and starts looking like what it actually always was. A decision to stop paying rent on a room you no longer need to live in. This isn't about excusing what happened. Some things were genuinely wrong, and pretending otherwise helps no one, least of all you. It's about recognizing that carrying the injury forward doesn't punish the person who caused it. It only punishes you twice, for the exact same offense over and over, for decades. There's also a quieter kind of letting go that arrives around the same time, releasing your grip on how things were supposed to turn out. The career that didn't unfold the way you'd carefully planned. The child who chose a completely different path than the one you'd imagined for them at the kitchen table years ago. Control, it turns out, was mostly an illusion you needed earlier in life just to keep moving forward one day at a time. Loosening that grip doesn't mean giving up on caring. It means finally admitting that outcomes were never fully yours to command, only yours to meet with as much grace as you could manage in the moment. You start to notice, too, how much lighter certain rooms feel once you stop needing them to go a particular way. A holiday dinner that doesn't follow the old script anymore. A visit that gets cut short. 20 years ago, a change like that might have ruined your whole week. Now you notice the disappointment arrive, sit with it for a moment, and then watch it pass through you without setting up permanent residence. That, too, is letting go. Not the dramatic kind, just the daily kind, practiced quietly, one small disappointment at a time. That's not giving up. That's setting down a weight you were never actually meant to carry this long. Which finally brings us to one of the sharpest lessons of all, the one about who actually stayed by your side. Somewhere along the way, your address book got smaller, but something interesting happened alongside that shrinking. The names left in it started meaning far more than the names that disappeared. Think about how many people you called friend at 30. Now think about how many of them you could call today at 2 in the morning if something genuinely went wrong. For most people, that second number is uncomfortably small compared to the first, and that comparison alone can feel like a small grief the first time you sit with it honestly. In your younger years, friendship often got measured by volume, how many people showed up to your birthday, how full your social calendar looked, how many names filled the pages of your address book. It felt quietly like a scoreboard you were supposed to keep winning. But somewhere after 70, after enough weddings and funerals and long stretches of illness and recovery, you get definitive proof of who friendship really was, because you get to see, with total clarity, who actually showed up when nothing was being offered in return. Not the people who liked your posts. Not the people who came to the party for the free food and the good music. The ones who sat with you in the hospital waiting room in silence, who called just to check in for no reason at all, who remembered the anniversary of a loss without needing to be reminded by a calendar notification. That is an entirely different category of person, and by this point in your life you know exactly who they are, sometimes down to a very short, very precious list. This isn't a sad discovery, even though it can feel like one at first, especially when you count how many names quietly fell away over the decades without ceremony. It's actually a kind of graduation. You no longer need to maintain 50 relationships to feel secure, because you finally understand that 5 real ones will hold more weight than 50 performed ones ever could, no matter how good those 50 looked from the outside. Quality was always the point from the very beginning. It just took decades of collecting the wrong metric to finally see that clearly. And there's something else worth naming here, something that surprises a lot of people once they notice it. The friendships that lasted often weren't the ones with the most in common on paper. They were the ones built on the fewest conditions. The friend who never needed you to be impressive. The friend who could sit in silence with you and not fill it with noise. Those relationships rarely announced themselves as special at the time. They just quietly outlasted everything that was louder. That's not loneliness. That's clarity, arriving later than you might have wanted, but arriving all the same, and worth every year it took to get here. If you're still here, this next part matters even more, because it's the one people are often most afraid to admit out loud, even to themselves, even in the quiet of their own thoughts. Reason number 5 is about regret, but maybe not the kind you're expecting when you hear that word. Ask yourself honestly, does it hurt more to remember something you did and wish you hadn't, or something you never did at all and now never will get the chance to? For most people who've lived long enough to look back with any real clarity, the second kind of regret cuts deeper, and it isn't close. The mistakes you made were at least yours, you took the risk, you felt the consequences, and somewhere in there you learned something, even if the lesson came at a steep price. But the things you didn't do, the trip postponed for someday, the apology you meant to make but kept putting off, the career risk you talked yourself out of at the last minute, the person you never told how you truly felt about them, those don't come with a lesson attached, ever. They just sit there, unfinished, forever asking what if, without ever offering an answer back. Psychologically, this makes real sense once you think it through carefully. A completed action, even a painful one, gets filed away by the mind as a closed chapter, something with an ending. An action never taken stays open indefinitely, because there was never an ending to close the loop in the first place. Your mind keeps quietly returning to it, decade after decade, looking for a resolution that can no longer arrive no matter how many times you replay it. This is why, when you ask people in their 80s and 90s what they'd change if they could, you so rarely hear, "I wish I hadn't tried." You hear, "I wish I had. I wish I had called more often. I wish I had gone when I had the chance. I wish I had said it out loud while there was still time left to say it." Somewhere after 70, this insight stops being abstract and starts becoming genuinely useful. Not paralyzing, but clarifying in a way that changes how you spend your remaining days. It's part of why so many people this age suddenly start saying yes more often, calling people they'd quietly drifted from over the years, finally taking the trip they'd talked about for a decade. Not recklessness, precision. They've learned, the hard way, exactly which kind of regret actually lingers and which kind eventually fades. There's also a strange mercy hidden in this understanding. Once you accept that the undone things hurt more than the imperfect ones, mistakes stop feeling quite so heavy. You start to see your own missteps almost affectionately, the way you'd look at an old photograph of yourself trying something brave and getting it wrong. At least you were in the arena. At least there's a story to tell. The things you never attempted don't even offer you that much. That's not fear talking. That's decades of evidence, finally being listened to instead of ignored. Now here's something almost nobody tells you before you get here, and it might be the gentlest surprise on this entire list. Somewhere in your 70s you start looking back, not at the milestones everyone photographed and celebrated at the time, but at the ordinary Tuesday afternoons nobody thought to write down or mark on a calendar. Try this for a moment. Picture your favorite memory from 30 years ago. There's a real chance it isn't the wedding or the graduation or the big vacation everyone still asks you about. There's a real chance it's something far smaller, a specific dinner at the kitchen table, an unplanned drive with the windows down, an afternoon that had absolutely nothing remarkable about it at the time it was actually happening. We spend so much of our lives waiting for the big, marked occasions, the milestones we're told to treasure, the ones that get photographed and announced and celebrated with a cake and a card. Meanwhile, the actual texture of a life gets built almost entirely out of the unmarked days in between, the ones nobody thought were worth remembering while they were happening. The problem is, nobody tells you this while you're living through those days, so you rush right through them on your way to the next milestone, treating the ordinary Tuesday as filler rather than as the substance itself. Somewhere after 70, with enough years now stacked up behind you to compare honestly, this becomes undeniable. You look back and realize the in-between days weren't in between anything at all. They were the whole thing start to finish. The milestones were just punctuation marks. The ordinary mornings were the actual sentences that made up the story. This realization tends to change how people spend the years they have left, sometimes quite suddenly. You stop waiting for a special occasion to use the good dishes sitting in the cabinet. You stop saving the nice sweater for someday and start wearing it now, today, for no reason at all. You start understanding that an unremarkable Thursday, spent with someone you love, doing absolutely nothing noteworthy, may well be one of the moments your future self would trade almost anything to have back, if only for an hour. That's a strange kind of wisdom to arrive at only in hindsight, but it's arriving now, while you're reading these words, and there's still time left to use it well. Some people describe this as finally understanding what their own parents or grandparents meant when they said, late in life, that they missed the ordinary chaos of a full house more than any single celebration in it. At the time, that always sounded like a strange thing to miss. Now you understand it perfectly. It was never really about the noise. It was about how alive an unremarkable afternoon can feel once you're paying close enough attention to notice. That's not nostalgia. That's finally seeing your own life at its true scale, for the first time. There's an old line, written well over a century ago, that seems to have been waiting the entire time for a moment exactly like this one to finally land. George Eliot wrote, "It is never too late to be what you might have been. Sit with that for just a second longer than feels comfortable. Not it's too late to change anything now. Not the best years are already behind you. The opposite entirely. A quiet insistence that really becoming all the way through, doesn't come with an expiration date stamped somewhere on it, no matter what the calendar or the mirror seems to suggest on certain mornings. Whatever version of yourself you've been circling for decades, almost within reach but never quite arriving, the door hasn't actually closed behind you. It just got quieter over the years, patiently waiting for you to notice it was still standing open the whole time. Read it once more, slowly, and notice how it doesn't ask you to undo anything. It doesn't ask you to reclaim your 30s or apologize for the years in between. It simply tells you, plainly, that becoming has no deadline attached to it. Whatever you've been putting off becoming, more patient, more honest, more soft with yourself, more willing to say the true thing out loud, that door is still open tonight, exactly where you left it. Which brings us to something a little harder to say out loud, but important enough that it deserves the full honesty. The way you finally come to understand your own parents, sometimes for the very first time. Do you remember a moment, maybe only in the last few years, when you suddenly understood exactly why one of your parents did something you resented for decades without ever fully questioning it? For most of your life, your parents existed mainly in the roles you needed them to play. Protector, provider, the person who was supposed to get it right so you wouldn't have to feel the consequences of them getting it wrong. When they fell short of that role, it often felt personal, even intentional, because a child's mind isn't built to imagine its parents as frightened, limited, improvising people just doing their best with what little they had at the time. Somewhere after 70, having now lived through your own decades of parenting, working, failing, and improvising through situations nobody prepared you for, something shifts inside you. You start to see your parents not as the mythic figures you once needed them to be, but as people flawed, frightened, doing their best with incomplete information, the same way you did with your own children. That old resentment doesn't necessarily disappear completely, and it doesn't need to, but it gets company now, understanding. And understanding has a way of loosening a grip that anger alone never quite managed to. This same shift, quietly and almost without you noticing, extends to yourself as well. The mistakes you made raising your own children, the ways you fell short of the parent you'd meant to be back when it mattered most. Somewhere after 70, you find yourself finally capable of forgiving that person too, the younger you who was also just improvising, also just doing the best they could with what they had on any given day. This isn't about excusing real harm, wherever it genuinely occurred. It's about finally releasing yourself from an impossible standard nobody could have met, including you, including the parents who came before you. It helps, too, to remember what your parents were actually working with. No internet full of advice, often no extended family nearby to lean on, sometimes barely enough money to make it through the month, and almost certainly no one ever sitting them down to explain what any of it was supposed to look like. They were figuring it out in real time the same way you were. Once you see that clearly, it becomes very hard to stay angry at someone for failing a test nobody actually handed them the answers to. That's not letting anyone off easy. That's finally putting down a judgment you'd been carrying against people, including yourself, who were only ever human the entire time. Which leads us to the last one on our list, and maybe the quietest, most important shift of all 8. Somewhere after 70, you stop asking, "What am I still useful for?" And you start asking a much better question instead. Who am I, apart from everything I do for other people? For most of your adult life, your worth got tangled up tightly with your usefulness. You were the provider, the fixer, the one people called when something needed handling right away. There's nothing wrong with that. It's how many of us built purpose for decades, and it genuinely mattered, every bit of it. But usefulness, by its very nature, changes as bodies change, as children grow independent and move away, as careers naturally come to an end. If your entire sense of worth was built on being needed by others, then needing less can feel, at first, disturbingly like disappearing altogether. But somewhere after 70, a different truth quietly surfaces, usually when you least expect it. Being needed less doesn't mean being loved less. And your value was never actually the tasks you performed for others. It was the person underneath all that performing the entire time, patiently waiting to be noticed. The wisdom you carry from every year you've lived, the way you make a room feel calmer just by being present in it, the stories only you remember and can tell, the particular, unrepeatable way you love the people around you. None of that ever required usefulness to exist or to matter. It was there the whole time, simply crowded out by everything you were always busy doing. This is, in many ways, the quiet reward waiting at the end of every lesson that came before it. Once you stop performing for others, once you let go of old grudges, once you understand which friendships were real, once you make peace with your regrets and your parents and yourself, what's left standing is simply you. Not the roles, not the resume, just the person who was in there the whole time, doing all that living. And it turns out that person, on their own, without a single task attached to their name, was always enough. That's not fading. That's finally being seen for who you were underneath it all, this whole time. So let's go back to that reflection in the store window. The calm you didn't recognize at first glance. That calm wasn't emptiness. And it wasn't resignation dressed up to look peaceful. It was the sound of a person who had finally stopped performing, finally stopped keeping score, finally stopped waiting for permission to just be exactly who they are, without apology and without an audience. Every one of the 8 things we walked through today lives inside that one quiet reflection. The time you finally noticed, the opinions you finally released, the grudges you finally set down, the friends who finally proved themselves, the regrets that finally taught you which risks were worth taking, the ordinary days that finally revealed themselves as extraordinary, the parents you finally understood, and the self you finally stopped needing to be useful in order to love. That's what changes after 70. Not less life. A truer one, lived on your own terms at last. If any of this landed somewhere close to home today, you're not alone in feeling it, and you don't have to sit with it by yourself tonight. This channel exists for exactly this kind of conversation, the honest kind, the kind most places are too rushed or too polished to have anymore. If you'd like more of these moments, the ones that make you feel understood instead of talked at, consider staying a while longer. Subscribe, not because a video asked you to, but because there's real comfort in knowing you'll have somewhere to come back to when you need it. And if today's reflection stirred something in you, tell us in the comments below. Someone else, reading it later at 2 in the morning when they can't sleep, might need those exact words just as much as you needed them right now. Thank you for spending this time with me today. It mattered more than you know.